Okay, so I believe this is live now. This is Joshua Phillips. I am testing out the weird concept of playing some video games while rambling over top of them. So this is tagpro, which is a fun little game online, plus me giving slightly unprepared advice to high school seniors. So I was on Twitter recently, and a teacher I'd had back in high school wrote a post that was titled, it was for something they were writing, and it was, "What advice would you give to high school seniors?" So while I'm playing Tag Pro, testing this out, I wanted to ramble through a few ideas I had, and I wanted to stick to strictly things that I would consider to be, like, I guess, analytical advice. I don't know what the right word is, but none of the stuff I'm going to mention is like motivational advice. It's all things I think are good ideas that you really couldn't sell on a Hallmark card. So, okay, let's see. My team is down by 1 point. To anyone watching who's interested in the gaming content, this is basically capture the flag. I think you'll be able to intuit most of the rules as you watch. So the advice for incoming high school seniors as school starts in a couple days, where I live, and I think pretty much everywhere around the country, it's about that time of year. So number one, and I think I'm an actual authority on this because I dropped out of college, and I think this is one of the main contributors. High school, generally speaking, really does not require you to act autonomously. And I don't mean that you don't have to make any decisions, which is obviously not true, but that there's so much structure around what you have to do that at a certain level, like if you just feel the motivation to succeed, there's not that much open-ended problem solving you have to do. And I think one way in which that can be a problem is that you don't develop the habits of maintaining your own schedule. I don't think work ethic is quite the right word, but self-motivating to do work once you start to realize that the only person immediately determining consequences is yourself. I'm sorry, that's rambling a bit. That's not really advice. The advice part of that is that I think insofar as you have any free time, hey, we lost this game. Insofar as you have any free time, one thing that might be a good idea is to pick some projects that have very little to do with school, or to pick some skills that you're not using to do better in class, and set your own independent goals or expectations for those, so that you're doing something where you are the only authority on how good you think it is. You're the only person determining how much time gets put into it. So you're getting into that practice of setting your own goals without constant reaffirmation of them, stuff like that. So that would be my first bit of advice, is to realize that high school does not demand that much autonomy of you, but especially if, say, you're going to college, you're going to suddenly be in charge of your own schedule, and there aren't going to be teachers checking on you daily to see whether you're doing all your homework. And if you don't study, there's a good chance nobody will be pushing back on you until you fail in classes or on tests or whatever. This was certainly part of the problem I ran into. So that would be the first thing. The second thing, I'm going to have to check my notepad file when I get popped here again, unless I can remember it. First one was autonomy. Yes, the second bit of advice that I feel like doesn't get mentioned is that, yes, let me preface this advice. Always check how these scholarships, programs, and everything in your area work before listening to what I'm about to say. Some places have weird structures, but so if you're graduating high school and you're looking at college or technical school or what have you, one thing to seriously consider is whether you should go immediately or whether you should take a semester or year gap year off. The main reason being that will give you some time to actually figure out what you want to be doing. And it'll let you talk to your high school friends and see which schools, how they feel about whatever school they ended up at. But the reason I think this is good advice is that a lot of people go to college with no clue what they want to major in, and they end up losing lots of class credits to a first major they had. So one, you might save a good bit of time and money if you take a gap semester or year to sort of think about what you want to do. The secondary benefit of that is you can go work a retail job for 6 months. And once you've worked retail for 6 months, you will be very committed to not wanting to go back to that lifestyle because customer service is miserable. It's not that all people are bad, it's that when you work a customer service job of any kind, you suddenly learn that there is nothing too absurd or too incoherent for someone to come complain about, including my personal favorite story where someone told me they were worried that if the business I worked at was too successful, that nobody would come to the business anymore. That was my favorite. But back to the actual advice here. I think there are lots of good reasons to actually take a gap year or at least a gap semester if there's no severe scholarship punishment. It lets you think about what you want to actually be doing. Might save you. You might not actually lose graduation time because you might realize what major you want to actually do. You can spend that time reading. You can spend that time thinking about what major you want. You can spend that time getting used to the fact that you're now in charge of your own schedule to tie that back into number one. And those were the two bits of advice I had that were sort of specific to the narrow context of people going into their last year of high school. Just to rehash it a bit with the autonomy point, right? One of the funny things is there are a lot of ways in which you are treated as not having any responsibilities right up until you're in college and suddenly you're an adult. This seems like a bad structure. Hey, I scored a point. This seems like a genuinely bad thing in a lot of ways without getting hyperbolic about it. The third point, which is not specific to the context of high school, but I think experientially is very relevant to lots of people who are 18, 19, 20, is that it's nice to have a good sense of how to not become, I think I have it written on my notepad file, an ideologically possessed idiot. And what I mean by that, for the advice coming here in a second, is it's very tempting to buy into sets of ideas that very easily explain all the complexity in the world in very simple terms, or to think you've thought an issue through because there's a really short explanation that sounds like it explains everything. I think this is normal. I think is a very rough heuristic. The people who have interesting thoughts have usually changed large chunks of their beliefs about politics and similar things at least twice, because it takes a couple rounds before you notice the pattern of falling for really simple explanations that aren't actually profound, deep explanations that simplify. They're just really snappy talking points that make you feel like you've figured out the universe. So I thought I would throw in some rough advice on trying to fight that. And I could ramble a lot about that and the extent to which I think I've gotten decent about that myself. But if I wanted to reduce it to a singular idea, It's that, one, you should always be looking for the intelligent people who disagree with what you think, not the unintelligent people. Because I think it's fair to say that for any position on, anything, that there are plenty of extremely dumb people on both sides, such that you can feel smarter than the other side by staring at them. A lot of my videos, I mentioned some funny examples of this. But it's definitely easy. No matter what you believe, it is definitely the case that you can find tons of people with extremely bad other ideas to make yourself feel smart, and that's not very useful. What you should be doing is looking for the smart people who disagree with you, and start with the premise, not that you're right, but that you need to figure out whether they're right to explain why they're wrong. So that'd be the first bit of advice on that one, is you should be looking for the good version of people who disagree with you, not the bad version, right? So just to pick a political example, if you think that, what's a political issue? So if you think, for instance, that the minimum wage should be significantly increased, the way in which you should test that idea is not by finding somebody very dumb in the comments on a news article online. You should instead be looking for, economists who think minimum wage increases would be harmful, and see whether there's any really good, interesting arguments from that kind of a resource. So that's the one, is, looking for the smart people who disagree with you, not the dumb people who disagree with you. The second part, and obviously these sound kind of similar, the second part of that is that you should always be questioning whether an argument that sounds good to you, is it actually a good argument, or does it just confirm your bias to want your side to be correct? And in some sense what this means is, you should be picking at the presumptions in your own beliefs as much as, or more, the presumptions in other people's beliefs. And I think one reason for that is that psychologically, people are much better at realizing why something they disagree with is wrong, and have lots of weird defense mechanisms for not applying that same correct standard to what they want to be true. I'm trying to think of a good example of that offhand. Here's another bit of advice for high school seniors. If you're doing a video presentation where you talk about your ideas, you actually need to do a good bit of preparation and have your examples on hand, because no matter how smart you are, you cannot trust your brain to come up with good ad-libbed examples on the fly. So there's some nice self-depreciating advice from my own little mistake in writing this video up. So, come on. Oh. Okay, I got popped. But I think that's the general rule, is you should be thinking about the assumptions that are made that form your view on an issue, and you should then ask whether those assumptions are good, not merely whether the people that disagree with you do a bad job themselves of explaining those weaknesses. So, Oh, this is a slightly strange example, so I do apologize for not being more prepared. I think one, and this is obviously a false dichotomy, but one sort of disagreement I see over the idea of the artistic merit of something. This is coming off of my last uploaded video, which was a defense of the idea that BattleBots, the robot fighting show, is a very nice piece of art that I quite appreciate existing. There's something of a false dichotomy in, aesthetic value of people who think stuff that requires skill or technical expertise is inherently better than things that are simple on one sort of side of this coin, versus people who believe that all artistic claims are purely a matter of subjective opinion on the other side. And hey, we won on time. Woo! So that's a bit of a false dichotomy. I would lean more towards the skill side on this, so we'll just take that side as if I believed it. The idea that art should be judged by the difficulty and skill that is required to produce it. Well, it might be the case that I think people who disagree with that make really bad arguments. Right? They just sort of shout art's just a matter of opinion, or they fail to address whatever I'm saying. But what you should be doing in practice is saying, okay, here's my view that art should be judged based primarily on the skill required to produce it and its reflection of, beautiful things. Okay, let's just start there. What you should do is look at that and go, okay, what would some alternatives to that be? Well, it would be that artistic merit is about the quality represented. Or the counterexample would be, is it really the case that complexity is what we actually judge? Now, it seems like a lot of the great works of art on this view are things that would be quite hard for me, if you've seen any of my videos where I'm drawing stuff, would be extremely hard for me to reproduce without 20 years of time. Okay, they scored there. But is that actually the essential unifying concern? Well, no, because if you had an artist who figured out how to do something extremely complicated, but I didn't like what they were producing with it, right? They figured out a way to code a computer to paint based on voice commands. Well, that would be extremely difficult. But if they were using it to paint, pictures of the poop emoji, I would not consider that amazing art. So clearly, I need to figure out a different standard. The bad way of approaching these sorts of questions would be to go, okay, I think complexity and some notion of intrinsic beauty defines good art. Here are a bunch of really bad, incoherent attempts to counter that mostly just consist of people shouting art is subjective. Once again, that last example, I do apologize because it wasn't very good. But to reiterate before I turn the recording off, the 3 little bits of advice I would sort of give to people going into high school. One is that you're probably quite underprepared for being in charge of your own time and scheduling and projects. So you should really try to find some ways to pick out some stuff that's entirely your own standards to get used to that habit of being in charge of your own stuff. Hey, we won that game. Fantastic. So the first one. The second one, you should seriously consider a gap year or semester. If you don't have a clear goal of what you want to do in college, you might actually save money and still graduate at the same time because you don't waste classes. You could spend that time, learning some skills you might have forgotten, especially math, if you're going to have math requirements. And thirdly, this is the one advice where I sound like a bit cliched, I suppose. Right after high school is the age where you tend to be deeply interested in finding really simple ideological explanations for everything. And it's important to find ways of resisting that temptation, like always looking at your own position and trying to think of an intelligent problem with it instead of looking for a stupid disagreement, so that you can reassure yourself that you're on the smart side of things. So please subscribe if you enjoyed it. I wanted to experiment with talking while playing over some video games. I do have a chess club. I have a bit of a rule about trying to keep my political stuff, this really wasn't political, but my political stuff separate from my chess community stuff. So I had to find a different game to play. But thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoy it. This is Joshua Phillips for Living Reason. Have a good night.